My husband's sister always mocked me for being just a nanny. She'd say, "At least I don't get paid to raise other people's kids." For weeks later, the child I cared for inherited a fortune, and I was appointed executor. Guess who showed up begging for a favor? My name is Marin. I'm 34 now, but this all started a few years ago when I was working as a live-in nanny in Montclair, New Jersey. If you know the area, you know the kind of families who live in the upper Montclair district, wealthy, well-connected, with perfectly landscaped lawns and kids in private schools. That's where I met Celeste and Raymond Elbin. They were good people. Busy, but genuinely good. Celeste ran a digital design agency out of Manhattan and Raymond was constantly on planes for business development. They had one son, Finley. I was hired to care for him when he was just turning 2. The position was supposed to be temporary, a year at most, but I stayed. And over the years, he became, well, not mine, but close. You can't raise a child for nearly a decade and not feel like a piece of them is stitched into your heart. I met my husband, Harris, at a fall community fundraiser the year Finley turned 5. He was the quiet kind, steady. We got close fast, and when we married, I kept working for the Elbins. They were more than employers by that point, they were family. They even helped with our wedding costs. But Harris came with one complication, his sister, Bianca. She had this presence about her, like she was constantly sniffing something unpleasant. I'll never forget the first time we met. She leaned in, gave me one of those half hugs where your arms barely touch, and asked, "So, are you, like, the babysitter?" I said, "I'm his nanny." She raised an eyebrow and smiled. "Ah. A professional babysitter. Got it." And from then on, that's how she referred to me. At every gathering. Every family event. Marin, the babysitter. Once, at Thanksgiving, when I offered to help with dishes, she actually said, "Don't worry, Marin's used to cleaning up after people's kids." Everyone laughed. I didn't. But I didn't push back either. I was raised to be polite, and honestly, I didn't care about her opinion. At the end of the day, I went home to a beautiful boy who ran into my arms when I walked through the door and called me his best friend. That meant more than whatever Bianca thought. Still, over the years, the comments wore me down. Bianca had 2 children of her own, and although she stayed home with them, she'd go out of her way to make sure I knew she was a real mom, and I was just, what? The help? I swallowed it. I figured she was insecure, or jealous, or maybe just unkind. I focused on Finley, on my work, and on building my life with Harris. Then, one spring, everything changed. Celeste and Raymond were traveling to Tokyo for business. It wasn't unusual, they did trips like this at least twice a year. Finley and I had a whole routine planned while they were gone. Movie nights, school drop-offs, maybe a trip to the aquarium on Saturday. But they never came back. Their plane went down somewhere off the coast of Alaska. Severe weather caused a reroute. Mechanical failure, they said later. No survivors. I still remember where I was when I found out. It was 6:22 a.m. Finley was eating Cheerios at the kitchen island. I was scrolling through my phone and stopped cold at a news alert. I reread it 5 times. Then 10. I checked the flight number again. I called their assistant. Then their lawyer. Then their family friends. It was real. And suddenly, the entire world tilted sideways. Within hours, the house was full of people. Lawyers. Officials. Distant family members. Neighbors bringing casseroles. It was chaos. Finley didn't cry at first. He just sat very still. His little hand gripped mine so tightly that my fingers turned red. I didn't cry either, not yet. I had to hold it together for him. 2 days later, Celeste and Raymond's lawyer, Mr. Calloway, called me into his office. That's when I learned about the will. They had updated it just 6 months before. I remember now, Celeste mentioned something about getting their grown-up stuff in order after a close friend passed. I hadn't thought much of it. But they didn't name any extended family. No cousins. No aunts or uncles. They named me. Me. The nanny. Executor of their estate. Legal guardian of Finley. Full responsibility, emotionally, legally, financially. I sat in that leather chair in Mr. Calloway's office, stunned. I hadn't even known they'd put my name down. And now, I wasn't just someone who cared for Finley. I was the one raising him. And not just in name. You see, the Elbans weren't just upper-middle-class rich. They were quietly wealthy. Stocks. Property. Inheritance from old money. The estate was valued at over $14 million, not including future investments that hadn't even matured yet. Trusts. Life insurance. Art. Assets I couldn't even pronounce. I was to manage the entire estate on Finley's behalf until he turned 25. $14 million. Managed by me. And that's when the vultures started circling. Bianca heard about it within days. I don't know if Harris told her or if someone else did, but suddenly she was texting me again. Nicely. She showed up at the house, acting like we were old friends. I can't even imagine how hard this has been on you, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. If you ever need help, or advice on managing money, she trailed off, waiting for me to invite her in. I didn't. A few days later, she tried a different tactic. Her husband had apparently made some bad real estate investments and they were going through a tough time. She asked if I could float them a small loan, just $250,000, to help get back on their feet. I stared at her in disbelief. She looked me straight in the eye like she didn't remember every passive-aggressive comment she'd ever thrown my way. Like she hadn't spent years treating me like I was disposable. I said, I'm managing the estate for Finley. It's not a gift shop. She blinked, then said, so, that's a no? That was definitely a no. She left in a huff. And I could feel the shift between us solidify into something permanent. What she didn't understand was that this wasn't just money. This was Finley's future. His education. His therapy. His dreams. His peace. She saw a number. I saw a boy who had just lost everything. And I would protect him. At any cost. Over the weeks that followed, everything in our world shifted. I moved permanently into the Elbans' home. It wasn't really a decision, it just happened. I couldn't leave Finley alone in that massive house filled with reminders of a life he'd lost. Every room echoed with silence. His parents' shoes were still by the front door. Celeste's perfume still lingered on the hallway rug. Their bedroom door remained shut for months. Finley stopped asking when they were coming home after the first week. He knew. He just didn't know how to say it. I tried to give him structure. I kept the morning routine the same. Breakfast at 7:30, school by 8 o'clock. We'd talk briefly in the car, about homework, basketball practice, or what he wanted for dinner. He never mentioned his parents. I didn't push. Grief, especially in kids, doesn't follow rules. At night, we'd sit on the living room sofa. Sometimes we watched movies. Sometimes we sat in silence. Sometimes he'd fall asleep against my shoulder like he did when he was 5. That first month was brutal. I barely slept. I was juggling grief, trauma management, estate logistics, and trying to hold myself together while raising a now orphaned child. And then, Bianca came back. This time, she didn't even knock. She rang the doorbell once, then opened the door like she belonged there. She walked straight into the kitchen with a manic energy, like she was playing a role in some movie where she was the savior arriving with good news. Marin, she said, placing her handbag on the counter like it lived there. Okay. So. I've done some research. I turned to face her, bracing myself. I talked to my accountant and, look, I don't mean to overstep, but I just think it would be so smart if you set aside a portion of Finley's inheritance into a trust that someone, like me, say, a family member, could help oversee. You know. For emergencies. Long-term planning. Just so you're not alone in this. I blinked. You mean take money out of a trust and give it to you? She smiled, patronizing and overly sweet. Not give. Oversee. I just think Finley needs a blood relative to help guide things. It's not really appropriate for a, she paused, searching for the word. Nanny, I finished. She didn't deny it. I stood still for a long moment. I was angry, but not in a yelling kind of way. It was deeper. Tired. Cold. I'm not discussing this again, Bianca, I said. The estate is locked. Finley's needs are covered. I'm doing exactly what Celeste and Raymond asked of me. And legally? You have no say. She tried to argue, something about blood, about intentions. She even hinted that maybe the will had been manipulated. That made me laugh, dryly. Celeste planned everything down to the letter, I said. You think she wouldn't have caught something like that? You didn't even send Finley a birthday card last year. Don't pretend you're invested now. She left in a storm. I didn't follow her. I was done playing polite. But her visits didn't stop. The next few weeks, she came by more than ever, always with a new angle. Once, she brought over her kids and suggested a cousin's weekend, saying Finley needed family. Another time, she brought a binder full of financial suggestions from a friend who worked in banking. At one point, she called Harris and accused me of keeping the family apart and hoarding Finley's life. Harris tried to play mediator. She's just worried, he told me one night. No, she's greedy, I said flatly. He didn't argue. I loved my husband, but this whole ordeal made me see our dynamic differently. He never challenged his sister. Never stood up for me, not really. And though he said he supported me, I realized how little he actually understood the weight of what I was carrying. I wasn't just looking after Finley anymore. I was fending off opportunists, managing lawyers, accountants, therapy sessions, and the raw emotional breakdowns that came at midnight when Finley had nightmares and couldn't breathe through the tears. There was one night, about 2 months in, when everything hit a boiling point. Finley had woken up screaming. He was shaking, soaked in sweat, sobbing for his mom. I ran to his room, held him for what felt like an hour, just letting him cry into my chest. I didn't say anything, I just stayed. After he finally fell back asleep, I walked into the hallway and sat down on the carpet. It was past 3 a.m. The house was quiet. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, realizing how isolated I had become. No one really saw the weight of it. And then I thought of Bianca. Of how, just weeks earlier, she was mocking me in front of her friends at a birthday party for raising someone else's kid like it's your own. How she once joked that I must have failed out of college to be doing this kind of work. How she rolled her eyes every time Finley hugged me like I was his person. And now? Now she wanted access to the fortune I'd never asked for, the trust one never expected to be in charge of. But not once had she asked how Finley was doing. Not once had she tried to help him heal. She didn't even offer to sit with him. It wasn't about him. It was about the money. That was the clearest thing in the world. After that sleepless night in the hallway, something shifted in me. I stopped trying to make people comfortable. Especially Bianca. I stopped replying to her texts. I instructed Mr. Calloway to funnel any financial inquiries through legal channels. I set clear, written boundaries with everyone circling the estate, including some vague second cousins who suddenly just wanted to check in and share old stories about Celeste. It was like blood in the water. The minute money entered the conversation, people showed up with the warmest smiles and the coldest intentions. But the only one who mattered was Finley. And Finley was hurting in quiet, complex ways. He had always been a bright, affectionate kid. Now, he was quiet. Withdrawn. His laugh, once easy and loud, was rare. He stopped playing piano. He barely touched his sketchpad. Some nights he wouldn't eat more than a few bites. I booked him with the best child therapist I could find in the tri-state area. Twice a week, in-person sessions. Once a month, joint sessions with me. Slowly, pieces of him began to peek back out. One day, he handed me a drawing. It was him, standing in front of the house. I was next to him, holding his hand. Behind us were two faint shapes in the sky, his parents, drawn like silhouettes with wings. Above our heads was a single word, written in his careful handwriting. Safe. I cried in the garage that night so he wouldn't hear me. It wasn't long after that moment that the estate audit came up. Calloway warned me. Big money always draws attention. There's going to be a review. Someone, maybe even Bianca, put in a request for an independent oversight review. We'll get through it. You've been doing everything right. Still, it rattled me. Even when you have nothing to hide, being under a microscope does something to you. They combed through receipts, invoices, statements, every purchase I'd authorized for Finley, from private school tuition to new running shoes. I had a spreadsheet that would put any CFO to shame. But it still felt invasive. Like I had to prove, again and again, that I was more than just the nanny. And that phrase. That damn phrase. I kept hearing it in my head. Bianca's voice. Just the nanny. Every time I walked past the mirror, every time I had to sign my name on something official, I had this quiet internal battle. Imposter syndrome, maybe. But grief does strange things. So does trauma. And being trusted with someone else's child, especially in the wake of death, comes with a kind of responsibility that no degree or job title can prepare you for. And still, there was Bianca. Still sending feelers. Still circling like a hawk. There were more subtle attempts now. She stopped asking directly for money and started suggesting partnerships. One email from her had the subject line, Finley's future, let's collaborate. She attached a proposal for a boutique children's clothing line she wanted to start. She said it would be inspired by Finley's style and could be partially funded by the trust for his benefit. She even included mock-up logos using Finley's initials. I sat there staring at the screen, absolutely floored. This wasn't just greed, it was delusion. I didn't respond. Instead, I saved every message, every document, and handed it all over to Calloway. If she wanted to push this into legal territory, I'd be ready. Meanwhile, Finley was coming back to life. Slowly, surely. He started playing piano again. At first just 20 minutes a week. Then more. I'd walk by the room and hear him messing with old scales or half-playing songs he used to love. He didn't want praise. He didn't even acknowledge he was doing it. But the music was there again. Like a heartbeat. He got into track and field. He made a few new friends. He even smiled more. We had our routines. Friday night pizza. Saturday morning dog walks. He wanted to adopt a puppy, and after months of research, we did. A rescue mix named Baxter, with 2 big ears and the loudest bark for his size. They became inseparable. There were still hard days. Of course there were. But there was healing. And I stayed close. Not hovering, but near. Present. Always there when he needed to talk, or sit quietly, or cry. And then came the letter. A thick, cream-colored envelope addressed to me, delivered by courier. Bianca was suing for guardianship co-authority. She'd hired a lawyer. She was claiming that Finley needed blood family involved in day-to-day decisions and that my position was inappropriate and legally vulnerable. It felt like a punch to the gut. Not because I was scared of losing, I had every legal right, and the Elbins will was airtight. But because it was such a low, disgusting move. To take a grieving child's life and try to leverage it for power. The audacity. The entitlement. Harris was furious. This is beyond anything, he said. I'll talk to her. This isn't okay. But I didn't want him to talk. I wanted him to act. I said, talking to her isn't going to fix this. She's made her choice. You need to make yours. He didn't answer right away. We both knew what I meant. And what came next changed everything. Harris didn't say anything that night. And honestly, that silence spoke volumes. I didn't push. I didn't cry. I just let the air settle between us. I had learned by then that silence could say what words often failed to. The next morning, he packed an overnight bag and left for his sister's house. He said he needed space to figure this out. That was fine. I didn't need him to choose sides. Because the moment Bianca made this legal, I had already won. Here's the thing about being underestimated for years. About being treated like furniture in someone else's life. Like background noise. They never see you coming. Bianca assumed, like always, that I was just the help. Sweet, small, agreeable Marin. She had no idea that I'd been meticulously documenting everything since the day the Elbans plane went down. Every email, every text, every shady suggestion, every veiled threat about Finley's future. And while she was playing checkers, I was consulting a legal team that had done estate and family litigation in New York and New Jersey for 25 years. They knew exactly how to respond. The first motion was swift, a counterclaim for defamation, emotional distress, and harassment, citing her repeated attempts to manipulate trust assets and harass a minor's guardian. The Elbans will had a protection clause. Anyone who legally contested its structure without just cause would immediately forfeit all future rights to challenge or inherit. That meant if Bianca pushed further, she'd lose everything. No more access. No visitation. No cousins' weekends. No holiday invites. Nothing. The court scheduled a hearing. When we arrived, she looked shocked. She clearly expected to walk into a room with me panicking and pleading. Instead, she saw me sitting next to a polished attorney who handed her lawyer a file the size of a brick. Emails. Texts. Photos of her showing up unannounced. The children's clothing brand. The attempt to launch a business using Finley's name. When her lawyer saw the stack, he pulled her aside. They returned 20 minutes later with a proposal to withdraw the petition with grace and dignity. We declined. We asked for a permanent restraining order regarding Finley's trust, and a formal agreement that she would cease all direct communication with me unless mediated by legal counsel. We also filed to bar her from accessing the property. She'd been showing up too freely for too long. The judge sided with us. And that was that. In one afternoon, she lost her grip. Not just on the money, but on the illusion of control. Of superiority. I walked out of that courthouse with Finley by my side. He didn't fully understand the legal details, but he knew something big had changed. On the way home, he asked, "Is she gone for good?" I said, "For us? Yes. She's not part of our circle anymore." He looked out the window, thought about that for a while, and nodded. Good. That night, Harris texted me. I didn't know she'd take it that far. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger sooner. I replied, she's not the only one who underestimated me. We didn't divorce immediately. But we separated. Peacefully. And for the first time in a long time, I felt weightless. Free. The estate was settled. The house was calm. Finley thrived. He turned 17 the next year. Got into track team nationals. Composed a piano piece that made his music teacher cry. We framed it. He kept a photo of his parents on his dresser, but he stopped needing to sleep with the light on. I still got called just a nanny from time to time by strangers or parents at school events who didn't know the full story. But those words didn't sting anymore. Because I knew who I was. I was the person too brilliant, thoughtful parents trusted with their son's entire life. I was the person who stayed when everyone else circled like vultures. I was the one who showed up. Every single day. And that boy? He wasn't someone else's kid anymore. He was mine, in all the ways that matter.